So today I'm going to be talking about a research program that I've been working on with a colleague at the University of Ottawa, Dr. Brad Young. And we've been looking at coaches' perspectives on learning to coach masters athletes or adult athletes. I'll just start off by quoting here from the International Sport Coaching Framework, the definition of coaching. And what you'll notice is that it talks about coaching as a relational activity, where coaches are understanding and interacting and influencing the settings and the people with whom they're working. And they need to build functional relationships. And in particular, it talks about at the bottom of this definition that coaches need to take into account athletes' goals, their needs, and their stages of development. And so what I'll be talking about in this presentation is really about sort of the psychosocial or the relational aspects of coaching. When we look at the research on coach learning, we see that coaches learn from a variety of different sources. So they learn from formal coach education, both programs that they're taking that are sport-specific, as well as, for instance, university education. They're learning from going on the internet and reading books. They're learning from other coaches and from mentors. And they're learning in previous experiences that they've had in and out of sport, including their time as athletes and their time as coaches. And then they're also constantly thinking about or reflecting on their experiences. And this, all of this research has been done looking at coaches who work with youth or adolescents or very young adult populations and not with older adult populations. And so when I'm talking about this older adult population or adult population, I'm talking about masters athletes, and that's how I'll be referring to them throughout this presentation. And these are athletes who are typically over 35 years old and who follow regular training in order to compete. And it's a really fast-growing cohort of athletes. For example, in 2011, the statistics were almost 10,000 masters swimmers registered with Masters Swimming Canada. And up to 70% of these athletes report having a coach. And so I started this research program trying to understand what is different about coaching adults relationally and psychosocially compared to coaching youth. So we started with looking at masters swimmers. And what we found was that when they spoke about their coaches, they wanted coaches who had experience and knowledge. They wanted coaches who would hold them accountable to their training and who would plan and structure their training and competition. We also found that the context of masters sport was very heterogeneous. What that means is that within one coached group that one coach is with, there would be very different athlete motives, different levels of competition, different personal characteristics, and they really wanted coaches to know when and to whom and how to give personalized feedback. And then a master's student of mine looked specifically at a case study of one coach who coached both youth and masters groups. And what he found was that the coach would provide greater opportunities for self-direction and questions and autonomy when working with her adults, whereas she was more directed and controlled when working with youth. And then we looked finally at the coaches themselves, and we asked them, what is unique about coaching adults? And what they talked about was the importance of bidirectional communication with adult athletes and being open to sharing leadership with them. They talked about the athlete's maturity and the importance of understanding their previous experiences, about personalizing goals and getting to know their athletes' preferences, and about using multiple motivational strategies on account of the fact that it was a heterogeneous group. So from there, we were interested in understanding what is out there internationally. We did a scoping review of websites looking specifically at coach education for masters athletes and at how is it that these coaches are getting this information. What we found was that the course-based coach education for adults, as well as any research-based recommendations on how to coach adults, is lacking. There are some websites that are dedicated to masters sport, but these typically talk about events, results, and pictures and that kind of thing. They may also have some information about the physiology of aging. There was also there were some websites specifically that looked into the social adult versus the competitive adult in Sport New Zealand. The South Australian Masters Athletic website had some professional articles from Masters coaches, and the Coaching Association of Canada has a booklet that they call Coaching Masters Athletes that has physiological information. So these applied websites, coaches can find useful information, but they need to know where to look and what to look for and how to interpret that information. When we look specifically at coach education, they do use a long-term athlete development model and other talent development models, but these are all based on working with youth and adolescents and not working with adults. So the purpose here is that I wanted to look at how do coaches perceive that they've learned to work with Masters athletes? And do they perceive that their formal coach education and their formal coach training is meeting their needs in coaching adults? And so the participants in the study were 11 swim coaches. These were typical coaches from 6 different clubs in Canada. They had all participated in some coach education. They had between 3 and 20 years of experience coaching masters. And while all of them were presently coaching masters, there were also 7 who coached or previously coached youth. They engaged in semi-structured interviews, and a thematic analysis was done to look at the sources of coach learning and their perceptions of coach education. In a previous publication, we had also interviewed these same coaches, and they perceived that they wanted and they needed specific information regarding coaching adults that were in line with adult learning principles. And so the focus of this publication was looking at the sources of where they were learning this and what were their needs. So I'll talk first about the results regarding the sources of their learning. As I'm driving home, I think the weather practice was good. My reflection period is immediately after. It's not prolonged throughout the day. Now, what's important to note here is that this reflection is very surface. It's not a very deep reflection. In regards to learning from their master's athletes' expertise, they said things like, I call upon the few experts we have. We have a few doctors and a few physiotherapists. None of what was said here was referring to those relational aspects that I was talking about earlier. And they talked about also coaching youth and how they had learned from that. So they said, I find physical manipulation to be the best way to go. I think it's because my original coaching was with age groupers where I'd move them around in the water. And so when they were talking about their experience coaching youth, they would talk about personal strategies that they would use, but not necessarily about how that applied to coaching adults. It's also noteworthy that only 4 of them talked about learning from coaching youth. In regards to their swim experiences, the coaches had pretty mixed opinions about whether their experience as an age group swimmer or as a youth swimmer benefited their ability to coach. So one said, how did I learn to coach masters athletes? Well, I started swimming. Age group swimmers who became coaches bring a lot of the age group stuff with them, which I don't think is particularly useful. They were hotshot swimmers in high school, and now they're trying to coach an 80-year-old. On the other hand, another said, I learned through experience to have empathy more than anything else. I've had knee issues and shoulder issues as a child, so I'm willing and open to listen to my information. Another one said, I swim at lunchtime and I come up with a practice at lunch and I do the same thing with my swimmers in the evening. So you can see how they were able to use their current swimming experience in regards to their coaching. They also talked about reading books and doing internet searches. So one said, I do a lot of reading, mainly on the web, because it's accessible and up to date. I'll look at either other master swim clubs, at programs and training workouts that other coaches create for master swimmers. Now, noticeably, they tried to read as much as they could, and this needed to not interfere with their lives, their home lives and career. Internet searches, they also noted, could be quite frustrating because they didn't necessarily know from where they had learned the information. So they talked about, I read it somewhere. So what was the credibility of that source? And they didn't talk about learning, teaching, or other psychosocial strategies to interact with adults. They did talk about learning from other coaches, so both from their network of coaching and from mentors. As a group of coaches, we try to share our experiences of how you manage that kind of spread in age, ability, motivation, and objectives. So here you can see the heterogeneous nature of that sport context coming into play. And the other thing that was noteworthy here was that they didn't really share with coaches outside of their club. So one said, I think the idea behind all these interviews that you're doing is a curriculum to be developed. Maybe that's a step in sharing. Compiling all these ideas is good because I don't see that sharing happening otherwise. And they talked about experiences outside of swimming. So things like, I used to be a teacher and I say coaching is equivalent to your prep work for classroom delivery. Finally, they talked about sources of learning from their coach education. And out of the 11, 7 of them spoke about this learning source. So they said things like, I learned through the NCCP, which is the National Coaching Certification Program, that there are various ways of teaching, where they say everyone learns in different ways, so you need to adapt your training methods. So again, the heterogeneous context. And they also said things like, as a technical trainer in my professional career, I've taken a number of courses on principles of adult learning and learning styles. I learned that everyone's there for a different reason. The way that adults receive feedback or interpret feedback is varied, so I use that information. When we look at the results of the coaches' perceptions of their coach education programs, we found that there was a lack of connection between the coach education programs and their coaching with adults. They perceived that the courses were really geared towards working with youth and not towards working with adults. So they said, with NCCP, you learn to work with children. It is catered towards maturation and development of young swimmers. You can't train adults the same way, and the NCCP doesn't recognize age. Nonetheless, they did have interest in coach education that was specific to coaching adults. So when they were asked, do you have any training or education related to working with adult athletes, they all said no. They said if there was an area of weakness in master swimming globally, it would be that there's too much training based on youth age group experience and not much on older master swimmers. On the other hand, some coaches also thought that their masters were not serious or competitive enough to warrant that their need to take coach education. So they said things like, well, if they were more serious at competing, yeah, I would probably take a coaching course. I haven't done a seminar on what's new out there for coaches for so long. I would say it would be good for me to go on a refresher. But for the level of masters that I have, it's not really that important. So that was interesting. In looking at what this all means, the sources that the coaches spoke of are really similar to those seen in previous research on coach learning. But the coaches appeared relatively unaware of learning how to teach adults specifically. In other words, those psychosocial and relational approaches. And despite interest in a course explicitly geared towards coaching masters athletes, the coaches put little value in their certification. Even though our previous research has shown that the coach's demonstration of preparedness through, for example, their certification is a sign of investment and immersion that masters athletes respond positively to. So in conclusion, these typical masters coaches that we interviewed may not engage in regular coach development. And this demonstrates some of the common challenges that are inherent in learning to coach masters athletes. We also note that there's an absence of messaging around the value of coach education for adults. And this might explain why there's no considerable or systematic expectation that master's coaches invest in their own formal education. What we came out of from this was that there's a need for a credible online platform where coaches can gain empirical information about the psychosocial aspects of coaching adults. And so we created one. And you may have seen Catalina Belalcazar's presentation last week, where she spoke a little bit more about this website and the creation of this website. I can also go into it, and so you can take a look here as we answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.